And I think this would be a good time to pivot into a discussion about what we know about the latest in the ceasefire proposals. You mentioned it a little bit in your report, John, but what's the latest?
So the talks broke down on the weekend, but are apparently back. The Israelis sent a delegation yesterday to Cairo. Hamas returned its delegation to Cairo, and the head of the CIA, William Burns, he stayed in Cairo. So there's talks that are happening right now. They weren't happening this weekend. The Israelis didn't show up to the original talks. So we don't, just to say off the top that the everything we get is from leaks. It's from leaks from the
Right.
Americans, it's leaks from the Qataris, it's leaks from the Egyptians. But I think we have a fairly good understanding of what the broad outline of the deal is. Do you want me to just go through it?
Please.
Yeah, so it's very similar to the one that we've been reporting on for months. Um, it's essentially staged. It's in stages, and the first stage, the stages are 6 weeks long, which is consistent. They've been that way the whole time. 6 week ceasefires, during which total cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of the IDF from urban areas, which is interesting because they're not in urban areas, but when these documents were being made, they were. I don't think people expected the IDF would be unable to remain in urban areas. So the withdrawal of the IDF, the increase of aid to 600 trucks a day, people allowed to return to their homes back to the north, um, and 10 hours a day of no drone overflight, no overflight of any kind, but it's really referring to the drones,
Right. Which are constant.
which are
And
constant.
not just over the past 7 months, but over the past 17 years.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
at least. Yeah.
Yeah.
So no 10 hours a day, no overflights, and that extends to 12 hours a day on the day that there's exchanges, which makes sense because it's dangerous to reveal your positions during the exchange. It's logistical. I think we've talked about this a number of times on the show that it's logistically challenging to safely get all of these captives into one spot because Qassam doesn't hold all of these people. So the number that they have, we saw proof of life videos over the last couple weeks that were interesting to note because those had not happened previously. So proof of life videos seemed to be the trade-off for more aid. We've seen an elevation of the levels of aid, still brutally low, but double what they were when they were under 100 for many of these days. And so we know enough now that there's 33 civilians and women soldiers in the first batch to be released. And those 33 would be released in the first 6 week stage. And roughly the soldiers, the numbers are flexible. Qassam is flexible on the numbers. They're not flexible on the principled issues about it, which is that ceasefire, withdraw, return, and reconstruction. Those are core issues. They won't make changes on. But Qassam is willing to negotiate around the margins of that, the numbers, the timeline, how the timing works, and which prisoners are involved. They'll negotiate on all of that stuff, which is why we needed to see Israel go to Cairo before there could be a ceasefire call. When the ceasefire prematurely was called yesterday, Israel wasn't in Cairo 2 days ago, wasn't in Cairo to make those decisions about a ceasefire. So even though Qassam appears to be saying that we're negotiating with the U.S. because that's who has to guarantee this agreement, unless Israel is there talking about which prisoners, then nothing. There won't be a final agreement unless the sides are face to face talking about the nuts and bolts about it. So the 33 prisoners would be released 3 a day in that first stage, the beginning of the reconstruction of the infrastructure, so power, water,
roads.
civil defense gear, allowing civil defense gear in so that they can fix the roads, fix the water, the sewage. So that's in the first stage. 60,000 trailers, 200,000 tents for people to live in. Hamas wants guarantees that people won't be rearrested when they're released. The prisoners are released to the West Bank and then just rearrested like Israel does. And this is a difficult situation for Israel because, of course, Israel doesn't want a ceasefire because a ceasefire is the end of the war. And if the war ends today, Israel's lost the war. They're the ones who have told us that, right? They're the first people to say, we lose the war, Netanyahu, Gallant. If we don't go into Rafah, we lose the war. We've lost the war. They're all very clear about that. They also believe it's an existential war. So they're losing an existential war. They've talked that into existence. Remember, Gallant said a few months ago, if we don't win this war, we can't live in the Middle East. So,
right, don't tempt us with a good time, right?
What do you wish for? Because they're clearly losing the war. There's no question. And there's no invasion of Rafah that changes that. Destroying Rafah, killing, the disaster that Rafah will be, that doesn't end the war. It doesn't get you a won war. So the Israelis see it as surrender. They don't have any of their captives. They haven't dismantled Qassam as an army. They haven't dismantled Hamas as the civil administration on a municipal level. So Hamas is the one they're negotiating with. So they said they were going to erase Hamas and they weren't going to exist. Netanyahu said not even in future generations will they exist. But now they're in Cairo right now, face-to-face, talking with Hamas. All of Hamas's top leadership is still intact, which is something that won't be true of the Israelis if this war ends. If this is a ceasefire, Netanyahu loses his job, Gallant loses his job, Halevi loses his job. Many of the division commanders will lose their jobs for the failure of October 7th. So the war is in this position right now to end with Hamas having all of its leadership intact, Israel losing all of its leadership, and having years of investigations to look into the failure and the defeat. So it's hard to be optimistic about this ceasefire proposal because of that. It's hard to imagine the Israelis accepting surrender. They see it as surrender,
right?
But they're not getting their prisoners back unless they do. So Israel's in a real strategic bind, and we've been talking about it for months on this show.
Yep. Something that they could have had on day one.
Yeah,
they could have had their prisoners back, right? Yeah.
And just to confirm, just to clarify for viewers, that everything John's just been talking about in the ceasefire details that were agreement leaks that were leaked to, it seems, by the Qatari mediators, perhaps, to Al Jazeera, was what was, of course, rejected by Israel. I mean, according to reporting, was initially put forward by them, or at least the Hamas were seeing it as an Israeli proposal that they then agreed to, and then Israel then rejected after Hamas agreed to it.
Right.
And that's always the Israeli tactic. I mean, going back decades to of the so-called peace process, Israel will appear to agree to proposals, and then when the other side agrees to them, Israel says, oh, well, actually, now we need to negotiate over the implementation of the proposals, or now we need to negotiate over this detail, and it just goes on and on forever. That's always been their tactic. And you even have American officials now leaking to the media saying Israel is negotiating in bad faith. But the Americans are still treating the Israelis with kid gloves and with just utter cowardice. We've had these reports in the last day or two that the United States is delaying shipments of 2,000-pound bombs because of concerns about how Israel would use them in Rafah. I mean, you could say, well, finally, but at the same time, I mean, it's just so galling that Biden was saying back in October and November that Biden admitted that Israel was bombing indiscriminately, and yet they were still airlifting the 2,000-pound bombs around the clock to Israel. So 30, 40, 50,000 dead Palestinians is fine, but now so all of a sudden they have their qualms over Rafah. And what we see what happened, Nora mentioned this in the news report, that when now Israel is occupying the Rafah crossing, so the Rafah crossing is closed. Medical delegations like the one Dr. Adel was on can't get in or can't get out. Injured Palestinians can't get out. Students, nobody can get in or out now. Rafah is the only crossing for people and was the main humanitarian crossing. And so Israel occupies that, and the United States, instead of telling Israel, leave the crossing, withdraw from the crossing, they start negotiating with the Israelis. And so we have these reports that, oh, yes, well, if you leave, then we'll put in an American security contractor to run the crossing. So we're going to placate you by placing the crossing under United States occupation, military occupation via mercenaries. So Israel gets what, so it's really a game of good cop, bad cop. I mean, or genocidal cop and even more genocidal cop, to be more accurate. And things have a logic of their own, because the Americans say, we don't want you to go into Rafah, and the Israelis go in, and then the Americans say, okay, you can go into Rafah, but it has to be limited. And then Israel goes a little bit further, and the Americans will say, oh, well, okay, you can go that far, but don't go any further, and so on and so on. You can see the dynamic. So unless there is a very firm line from the United States and the other accomplices in this genocide, I don't think that, it is very difficult to be optimistic, let's say. But at the same time, none of this is set in stone. None of this has to happen. It only will happen if Israel, Israel is a proxy. Israel is the proxy of the United States. It'll only happen if Joe Biden and his henchmen allow their proxy to do this.
Yeah. So we'll see. I mean, in the coming days, I'm sure there's going to be more headlines about these ceasefire proposals. It's going to be.
Yeah, I think we should
intense.
I think we should be looking ahead to many days coming up of ceasefire proposals. If you see many days of ceasefire talks, if they stay in Cairo, if all the three delegations stay in Cairo, I think those are clues that things are moving.
Yeah.
And it's entirely possible that this limited Rafah incursion is pressure. It's a pressure tactic. There's a number of pressure tactics happening at the borders. They've now taken over the two main crossings, as has been noted, Kerem Shalom and the Rafah crossing. The only way for people to leave Gaza is closed, and Rafah is a pedestrian terminal, but that has been used for aid throughout this war. And so that's significant pressure to close those two crossings is putting significant pressure. So you can see multiple fronts of pressure that the Israelis are putting on to try to get to put pressure on Qassam. And in the Israeli media, they say that they're going in to destroy Qassam and rescue their hostages. So they say this every time. This is the last stronghold of Qassam. That's what they say, the last stronghold. But we remember when Khan Yunis was the last stronghold for Qassam, right? Khan
We
Yunis was where
remember when El
Muhammad
Shifa
Abdullah-
Hospital was the last stronghold.
Right.
Where is
Right.
that multi-story Disney World that was under
Mhm.
El Shifa Hospital?
Yeah,
So
the only multi-story thing under Shifa is there's multi-layered mass graves. They keep
That's right.
They just this morning revealed another layer to these mass graves. This war has been an appalling set of crimes from the moment it started.
The most appalling Israeli reaction I've seen to the mass graves is, oh, the Palestinians dug those mass graves. It was nothing to do with us. So the Palestinians buried their own dead that you then killed, and then you blame them for that. It's utterly disgusting.
and also,
Great.
they're finding bodies zip tied.
Yeah.
Palestinians would not be burying the loved ones zip tied.
Right.
That just doesn't happen.
Or
We-
with
we've seen-
signs that
we've
people are
seen-
buried alive. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with
We
metal
saw-
attached to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've seen how Palestinians, even in the most dire circumstances, will still try to give the dead dignified burials, say the funeral prayer over them, and give them a dignified burial. They're not going to dump them in pits with zip ties on them. That just doesn't happen.
That's horrifying. Just unspeakable. Is there anything we want to say about the pier? The U.S. military announced that it had completed the pier, the floating pier apparatus thing off the coast of Gaza. John, what's
Yeah,
the
so
latest on that?
as I said last week, completing the pier is easy. The pier is like Legos. They just assembled it. It creates a causeway. They all hook into each other, and then they anchor to the bottom of the sea. So they built a floating dock that's 3 miles offshore that's anchored to the seafloor, and they have now built apparently the causeway, which is the 1,800-foot pier. The pier, they're calling it a causeway because of the way that it sits.
Right.
And so that causeway has been built, but as with all of this project, that's not interesting that it's been built. That part was easy. The interesting part is that suddenly, as it's built, they're not attaching it to the shore for reasons that were apparently said to be weather, which doesn't sound super convincing in the summer in Gaza. I did see that there was some rain over the last 36 hours, but nothing that would prevent you from anchoring to the shoreline. So not clear what this delay is about for this pier. But also the ceasefire negotiations will make the pier irrelevant. Right. That's because the Israelis in the ceasefire negotiations will have to withdraw from the Netzarim corridor in those negotiations. So, and
Another $300 million just
$320
vaporized into thin air.
project minimum, they say.
Yeah.
1,000 soldiers off the shore.
Right. Amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's unclear what will happen. Maybe the Americans will come on shore and the Israelis will leave. The Palestinians will not attack the aid pier if the Israelis are not involved in it. If Palestinians are accepting the aid at the end of the pier from U.S. soldiers would not be targets. Qassam has said through their entire history that they don't target Americans. So the idea that they would fire on American troops on that pier, it doesn't match their history of struggle and the principles of their struggle. So I don't know. I don't think the Americans expected to be building this pier without a ceasefire. I think that they thought a ceasefire was coming and they were going to thread the needle during that ceasefire. And that's just clearly not the case right now. But the ceasefire is there to be agreed to. At least this first stage, the first stage of this ceasefire is ready to be agreed to. It's civilians and women soldiers. They have the numbers. It's 50-1 for the women soldiers, for women prisoners. it's 30 to 50 to 1 for the civilians. That exchange, we've been saying it for months, is not complicated. That's a very easy exchange to do. Their next stage, where you're negotiating for commanders, battalion commanders, and even division commanders, brigade commanders, that's a complicated negotiation. But this first stage, to stop the war, to allow people to move home, to build, to repair the infrastructure, this can happen.
Yeah.
This can happen.
All right. Well, thanks for that.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.